Peter, we're on to talking about collection and pre-filtration, and I would like to start with talking about roof and roof materials.
Excellent, Michelle. A really good topic that we need to look at.
So, what is the common sense recommendations, the straightforward common sense recommendations that you would tend to give people when they say, "Hey, what should I do for my roofing material? I need to make a selection."
There's a lot written about the correct roofing materials or the potential water quality from different types of roofing materials in the rainwater harvesting literature. But surprisingly, the water quality from roofs, from a whole range of different roofing materials, doesn't vary greatly from our research, except for if maybe you've got definitely shouldn't have lead flashing on roofs if you're going to be using the water for drinking, for example, rainwater for drinking. A lot is made of roof material types, but I think the other way to look at it is what types of roofing materials should we be really watching out for, because there's a whole range of materials, regardless of what's in the literature. The research shows that they perform fairly similarly, but there are some materials that we need to watch out for, and clearly lead flashing is one of them.
Mm-hmm. What else is on that list?
Painted roofs, you have to ensure the painting is non-toxic. So lots of paint materials in the past had lead or cadmium or other metals like that in them. Well, you really don't want that in your paints if your roofs are painted. There's some concern sometimes about concrete tiles that may have fly ash in them. I must say I'm less concerned about that. And again, if you've got concrete tiles on your roof, you're more concerned about how those tiles are sealed.
Right, if the grout used has anything in it.
Yeah, and
Right.
and also the manufacturing, the finish of the concrete tile. So, there's some sorts of terracotta tiles that have a smooth finish on them because the terracotta finishing also creates this hard coating around the internal structure. So different types of tiling will have different types of surfaces on them, and usually all of these things are going to be okay, but the more porous your concrete tile is, the more it may have some effect on the amount of water will actually run off your roof. I would say that'd be minimal anyhow. And a really porous tile might more readily hold other materials on your roof. But our research has shown that's really not such a significant issue. Be careful of copper roofs. Copper is...
I don't know very many domestic urban homes with copper roofs, but
I've seen some in New Zealand, and
okay,
people wanted to have very trendy homes, but copper's a very expensive commodity.
Yeah.
And there was a trend a few years back, I'm sure there isn't now, of having copper downpipes, or as you guys call downspouts. And obviously that peripheral component of the rainwater harvesting system had an impact on the water quality.
Right. Yeah, you bet. I've noticed in both the ARCSA Standard 63 as well as in the new Canadian CSA standard on rainwater harvesting, there's definitely, both of those documents refer to third-party standards. One of them is, I think, NSF 151, and another one is, I might be getting the numbers wrong, NSF 61 perhaps. Both they're kind of these third-party rainwater potability standards, and they're suggesting that all of your components and your roofing materials should meet one of these two standards to confirm it's non-toxic and safety for use in rainwater harvesting systems. But what I found in practice is that the industry compliance or industry is not bothering to go out and get these third-party certifications. So the codes and standards are saying, look for materials with these certifications, and then in real life there's nothing available.
I think that conversation, Michelle, is a surrogate for, I think anyone designing these systems might need some a clear-eyed insight of how these industry works. These third-party certifications by so-called standards organisations are private organisations with their own commercial interests, and when they get called up in standards, they whatever they recommend is given greater status than maybe they should do. At all times when you're designing, no matter what you're designing, one of the early issues you're thinking of are what are the components that the market provides and are readily available. And then your next step in the design process is how to adequately use these components in my design process, and whether or not they're going to be safe. Remember earlier on we were talking about the rainwater treatment train and how roofs actually behave. The link between what might be in the components or the roof structure versus the behaviour of the whole rainwater treatment train is something that should be considered, because the impact of most of your standard roof products on the behaviour of the entire rainwater treatment train and the quality of water is not as dramatic as it's made out.
Right. In fact, the tank is probably has a far larger, the tank materials likely have a far larger impact on the quality of the rainwater, the stored rainwater, than the roofing materials. Would you agree?
Yes, and even the tank materials we found, except for some materials in some configurations, don't really have that greater effect on the final water quality, but the tank material has more impact than the materials you make the roof and the gutters out of. Except
but so this is fascinating, because honestly, when I read, the two most common standards in North America, you would think, just based on reading those, based on their emphasis on the materials needing to meet certain standards, I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like there's almost a bigger emphasis on the material than there is an emphasis on the configuration and the design overall.
I would totally agree, and I would propose...
And so that leads someone like me reading that to think that the materials are, almost paramount of importance. And I don't want to... I also need to be careful in my wording, because, I'm not trying to say that the materials aren't important, but it definitely feels like there's an overemphasis on, possibly, on that compared to what the research has shown.
I totally agree, Michelle. And it's very easy for people doing this sort of work who perhaps in writing standards don't have a great experience of rainwater harvesting to overly focus on materials, because it's easy to do, and not focus on the design configuration, the harvesting system, and the process.
And I would say that also is so true of just a common perception of rainwater harvesting, because even when I have people come and tour my house, the number one question I get about rainwater harvesting is, can you harvest rainwater off of an asphalt roof? Which actually I want to throw that at you. Is it safe?
We keep coming back to this one in this course. So I said earlier on when you asked me about it, there's actually an entire catchment in Western Australia where the Water Authority has asphalted 30 hectares. I don't know what that is in acres. It's a lot of acres, probably 100 acres, of a catchment, because it's a relatively dry climate, to maximize the efficiency of the water supply catchment. And if you compare this to how we manage our city water supplies, if you measured the water quality that on the other side upstream of your storages, it's always going to be horrible compared to what happens to it in the storages and then when it comes out and it's treated and so on. So I think we sort of get this around the wrong way with rainwater harvesting, don't we? We say if we manage all the materials and we overly weight the impact of the materials in our thinking, everything's going to be okay. Well, no. But so what we need to do is have a common sense view of these materials and use them in the right way. Now, depending on what you're using the water for and what sort of treatment and rainwater harvesting treatment train you have after your roof, even your asphalt roof might be okay. So you mightn't be using it for drinking. You might be using that water for other purposes, and you might have finished this course with us and learned how to do a great treatment train design. So what came out of the other end of your system is fairly high quality water compared to what might come off the roof. We still need to be careful with asphalt. If we've got this interface between asphalt, lead, copper and drinking, we need to be very, very careful. So let's not underestimate that. And we should think about that carefully in our design. My instinct is if it's an asphalt roof, we need to check that it gives us adequate water quality in our rainwater harvesting system with our design before we even think about using it for potable use, and that'd be my recommendation.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate actually, because I think that that's possibly going to be a barrier to widespread adoption for sure in Canada and my home city, because asphalt is by far the most popular roofing material. Probably 90% of homes have that.
We need to think about, in that context, we need to think about what sort of asphalt is it, how's it applied, does the asphalt actually give up materials into the rainwater, or because it's a certain type of asphalt applied with shingles to create a sealed roof structure, maybe it stays on the roof and doesn't end up in the rainwater. I guess I learnt that lesson from the West Australian water supply catchment where they asphalted the whole catchment. It depends on the asphalt and how it's applied and how it performs, because when the lady who managed this catchment presented this at a conference a couple of years ago, there were 300 people sitting in the room and 300 hands shot up to say, oh, you can't be doing that, that's really dangerous. And she said, well, no, as a matter of fact, it's not, because the way the asphalt's been made as part of this catchment system, it doesn't give up materials into the water supply. And you know what, we've tested it and we know it doesn't. So I guess there's a less of expert advice if you're thinking about potable use of rainwater from an asphalt roof.
So then, do you have a favorite roofing material? Do you know what's out there that's really almost, I'd say, best bang for your buck, right? Because there's always that consideration too. One of the reasons asphalt is popular is because it's relatively cost effective, right?
Well, the components available, best bang for your buck. Solution's got to be cost effective. My home roof, half of it is galvanized iron and quite old, and it works beautifully, because we know zinc is not a health concern.
Although I've seen in literature that there's recommendations against using galvanized roofing.
Yes, and I don't know why it's in the literature, because if a galvanized iron roof starts to decompose because it's old, maybe then you need to start thinking about whether or not you're replacing your roof, regardless of whether or not you've got a rainwater system. But if it starts to get old, what happens is it gives up zinc. It releases zinc as it starts to age and corrode. And zinc is not a health hazard. If you got, we had this in one of the other houses we had with rainwater harvesting systems on it. You get higher zinc concentrations in your rainwater. It's harmless to you. However, it will make the water taste hard if you're drinking it. Obviously, you need a lot of zinc in rainwater before, and any water supply, before it starts to become an issue. It could be other metals in the way the galvanized iron is made that could be a concern, but it's iron and zinc, and both of them aren't substantial health concerns unless you've got a very high concentration of them. So basically, I don't know why they turn up in standards as a problem, because they're produce one of the best water qualities in the research. The other half of my roof, the newer section of the roof, I have what's called colour bond, which is basically sealed metal roofing material. So it's a paint sealer over the top of the galvanized iron, basically, and it seals everything in to stop it from corroding. And it's like an enamel coating. It's very hard,
non-toxic.
Yeah. And our research shows that sort of roof material produces the best runoff from roof results than any other material.
Any research on some of the other maybe less common roofing materials, like even wood shingles or
Wood shingles is a really interesting issue because yes, we have done some research on that, but if your wood's been treated with some chemicals to make it last longer, then you need to think very carefully about the quality of rainwater you'd expect of that. So if your wood's been treated by arsenic, for example, which does happen, well, you really don't want arsenic in your water supply, do you?
It reminds me, I think, too, in really wet climates, asphalt is often treated as well with some anti-mold type coating. So it's the same, it's almost, that question can apply to lots of different roofing materials, right? What you put on it could end up and would end up in your water system, right?
Absolutely. And and the most opportunity for those treatment and coatings to end up in the water system is early in the life of a roof. As a roof gets older, that's probably going to be less of a problem. So we talked about testing in an earlier lesson and module. If in doubt, in this sort of situation, at the end of your rainwater treatment train, before you decided exactly how many uses you might use from your rainwater harvesting system, this is where you would take a sample to make sure that your different types of roofs that you're not sure of are not providing something that might be harmful. And the thing to be very aware of with this is it would apply to your particular roof, not generically to all sorts of roofs with same sorts of roof material. Because as I talked about before, the material that might be used to make your wood shingles last longer, the treatment might be different in your wood shingles versus someone else's wood shingles. And
but then how would you even detect that? Like you'd have to even know what you were testing for, wouldn't you? If you were doing if you just, I guess, would you send your water in for one of those standard water potability tests, and would it detect some of these things like arsenic?
I think that highlights an issue of if it's an existing house and you're going to build a rainwater harvesting system, You might need to do a bit of historical homework to find out how the house was built, what materials were used, particularly on the roof, if you can. So rather than run straight out to a laboratory to get testing, do your homework about the materials involved and whether or not those materials were treated with what type of treatment mechanisms and components before you even think about going to get testing, because that will then say to you, oh, I need to ask the lab if there's arsenic or lead or something like that in my rainwater, because then it'd be a far cheaper, more understandable test result than saying, I'm not sure, go and test everything, which can give you quite confusing results. If you're building a new house, or you're renovating a house and fixing your roof, there's a perfect opportunity to choose, within market affordability, materials that better suit your intention.
Yeah, absolutely. One more time, you said it earlier, and because I mentioned it early in the book about how important it is to keep your roof cleaned, I want you to share with us what your research has actually shown about the necessity of getting up there and cleaning your roof.
Well, the research has shown it's not really that important at all. And I think
I'm happy to hear that, because I'm really lazy when it comes to maintenance.
So am I, Michelle. My roof gutters are usually full, and in my household, the family got sick of me being the slackest cleaner of roof gutters you can get, so they got some roof mesh, so the gutters don't fill up with leaves anymore. But what we actually found with, moving aside from the humour here of us rainwater harvesters, you and I, Michelle, are very slack with cleaning our roof and gutters. It says a lot, doesn't it? The research actually hasn't shown that this is a big issue, and it's actually showing some really interesting counterintuitive results until you think it through. Like the guy who doesn't clean out his roof gutters, their water quality in a lot of our surveys turned out to be better than those who clean them out all the time. However, the guy who doesn't clean out his roof gutters is got half the rainwater yield that the guy who does clean out his roof gutters. And when we were trying to think about why the hell that was going on, it was because all the material caught up in his gutters was actually filtering the rainwater before it actually ended up in the rainwater system. So you should be periodically, as necessary, cleaning out your roof gutters. Having it full of leaves and debris cannot be good for water quality in the long run. But from a practical sense, if that debris is deteriorating in your roof gutter system, it's actually destroying the materials in your roof gutter. So your roof gutter will start falling apart. So the driver actually to not allow a large build-up of deteriorating, decomposing materials on your roof and your gutter is going to be more about you want your roof and your gutter to last long enough. And your secondary issue is, it'd be good if it wasn't impeding on the behaviour of my rainwater harvesting system. So cleaning your roof all the time, not necessary. Cleaning it as necessary to get rid of build-up of materials and debris, well, absolutely, you need to do that. But you need to do that anyway.
Sounds great.